It was a Thursday evening, and I was heading home after another grueling day at work. I'm an insurance adjuster, hardly the most glamorous job, but it's what I do. It pays the bills, even if it doesn't exactly light a fire in my soul. My wife, Emily, works at a local boutique. She's always had a flair for fashion, with an eye for what looks good and what doesn't. We've been married for 8 years now, and while our marriage isn't exactly thrilling, I've always considered it stable. We live in a modest 2-bedroom house in the suburbs. It's not much, but it's ours. Over the years, it's seen us through plenty, our share of fights, makeups, and everything in between. Our routine has settled into something comfortable, predictable even. Work, home, dinner, maybe a show or a book, then bed. It's not the stuff of fairy tales, but it's life. Or at least, it was. That evening, as I pulled into our driveway, something felt off. Emily's car was already there, which was strange since she usually worked until at least 8. It was only 6. The front door was slightly ajar, and my pulse quickened with a sense of unease I couldn't quite place. I stepped inside, calling out for her. No response. When I reached our bedroom, I froze. There was Emily, furiously packing her things into a suitcase, clothes flying around the room like she was in some kind of frenzy. "What the hell is going on?" I blurted out, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. She didn't even look up at me, just kept throwing things into the suitcase. "I'm tired of living paycheck to paycheck with you," she spat, her voice cold and cutting. "And I found someone with 12 inches, not like your 4 inches. And of course, he's younger and richer." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. I just stood there, trying to process what she had said, trying to make sense of the sudden venom in her voice. This wasn't the Emily I knew, or thought I knew. Before I could even respond, I heard the rumble of an engine outside. I turned to the window and saw a sleek, black luxury SUV pull up to the curb. The man who got out was everything I wasn't. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a smug grin that made me want to punch him. He strolled up to the door as if he owned the place, his eyes locking with mine. "Hey, loser," he said with a sneer. "She belongs to me now. You and I are leaving the kids. We don't want these monsters." It took me a moment to realize he was talking about me. It was so absurd, so surreal, that I almost laughed. Almost. I looked at Emily, one last desperate plea in my eyes. "If you leave with this jerk, don't think you can come back when the fantasy fades." But she didn't even look back. She just zipped up the suitcase, walked past me like I didn't exist, and stepped out the door. The last thing I saw was her climbing into that SUV, laughing at something he said as they drove away. And just like that, she was gone. I guess you could say I should have seen it coming, but hindsight is always 20/20. The cracks in our marriage didn't appear overnight. They were subtle, creeping in over time like weeds in a garden. At first, I ignored them, convincing myself that we were just going through a rough patch. Every couple does, right? Emily and I met in college. She was the girl everyone noticed, always dressed to perfection, with a confidence that drew people to her like moths to a flame. I was more reserved, the kind of guy who spent more time in the library than at parties. Somehow, against all odds, she noticed me too. We were opposites in so many ways, but we fit together, or at least I thought we did. Our early years were great. We had the usual newlywed glow, full of dreams and plans. We traveled when we could, spent weekends exploring new restaurants, and had plenty of late-night talks about our future. But as the years went by, life happened. The demands of work, bills, and the monotony of daily life took their toll. Those late-night talks became fewer and fewer. The passion we once had faded into routine, and we settled into a comfortable, if uninspired, rhythm. Emily started working at the boutique about 3 years ago. She loved it there. It was a small shop, the kind where the owner knew all the regular customers by name. Emily thrived in that environment. She always had a knack for making people feel special, and she quickly became the shop's top salesperson. I was proud of her, but there was something else too, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. She started working longer hours, coming home later and later, always with some excuse about a customer or a late delivery. I wanted to believe her, but the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. It wasn't just the late nights that bothered me. It was the way she had started to withdraw, bit by bit. She stopped asking me about my day, stopped laughing at my jokes. We stopped having sex as often, and when we did, it felt different, like she was just going through the motions. I told myself it was stress, that it was just a phase, but deep down I knew something was wrong. There were other signs, too. She started spending more money, buying clothes and shoes that seemed far too expensive for our budget. When I asked her about it, she'd brush me off with a smile, saying she got them on sale or that she'd been saving for a while. But the nagging doubts kept growing. I didn't want to be the jealous, paranoid husband, so I tried to ignore the signs. I told myself that she was just going through a phase, that things would get better if I just gave her space. I focused on my job, throwing myself into work to avoid thinking about what was happening at home. But the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. It was around this time that I noticed she'd started texting more. She'd be on her phone constantly, smiling at messages, and quickly putting it away when I walked into the room. When I asked her who she was talking to, she'd say it was just a friend or someone from work. I wanted to believe her, but every time I saw her glance at her phone, that knot in my stomach tightened a little more. In those moments, I should have confronted her, demanded answers, but I didn't. I was too scared of what I might find out, too afraid to admit that maybe, just maybe, the woman I'd married was slipping away from me. And so, I kept my mouth shut, hoping that whatever was happening would pass, that we'd find our way back to each other like we always had. But that was just wishful thinking. The reality was, Emily was already gone, long before she ever packed that suitcase. I just hadn't realized it yet. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, about 3 months before that disastrous Thursday. Emily had gone out with some friends, or at least that's what she told me. I didn't think much of it at the time. I'd gotten used to her having her own social life, something separate from mine. We were both busy, and I figured it was normal for us to have our own space. But that day, something felt off. She had been unusually secretive, her phone glued to her hand all morning, and she seemed distracted, barely present even when she was sitting right next to me. I brushed it off, telling myself not to be paranoid. Still, when she left, a nagging curiosity gnawed at me. I tried to ignore it, but after an hour of staring at the TV without really watching it, I caved. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a drink, hoping to settle my nerves. But instead of calming down, the alcohol just made me more anxious, more certain that something was wrong. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't help myself. I went to her nightstand and pulled out her tablet. Emily was always careful to keep her phone locked, but her tablet? Not so much. She probably never imagined I'd go through it. And normally, I wouldn't. But I was desperate for some kind of reassurance, something to tell me that I was just being paranoid. I opened her messages and scrolled through the usual conversations. Friends, co-workers, nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to give up, I noticed a name I didn't recognize. Derek. My heart started pounding in my chest as I opened the thread. The messages were casual at first, jokes, banter, the kind of thing you'd see between friends. But as I scrolled further, the tone changed. The jokes became flirtatious, the banter more intimate. My hands started to shake as I read through weeks of messages, each one more damning than the last. He was charming, confident, everything I wasn't, and he clearly knew how to get into her head. I could see her slipping away with every word they exchanged. And then, I found it. The text that shattered any lingering doubt I had. It was a photo, A selfie of Derek, shirtless, in a bathroom I didn't recognize. The caption read, "Wish you were here." Emily's reply was immediate and all too familiar. "Soon." My stomach twisted into knots as I scrolled back up through their conversations, looking for more clues. The signs were all there, talks of meeting up, her complaining about me, him offering a shoulder to cry on, and eventually, the inevitable happened. A text from her, late at night, saying she was finally free and asking if he was still up. His response was immediate, and the conversation that followed left nothing to the imagination. My blood ran cold as I realized what had been going on, right under my nose. Emily had been seeing this guy for months, sneaking around behind my back, making a fool out of me. And all the while, I'd been too blind, too trusting to see it. I put the tablet down, my mind reeling. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to confront her. Part of me wanted to storm out, to track her down and demand answers, but another part of me was too paralyzed by the shock, too devastated to move. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at nothing, my mind racing through every possible scenario. When Emily came home later that evening, she was her usual self, cheerful, chatty, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just spent the day with another man. I tried to play along, pretending I hadn't just had my world turned upside down, but I could barely look at her. Every word she said felt like a lie, every smile a betrayal. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, while she slept peacefully beside me. My mind kept replaying those messages over and over again, each one a dagger to the heart. I knew I couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep living this lie, but I didn't know how to confront her, how to start that conversation without everything falling apart. The truth was, it had already fallen apart. I just hadn't been ready to accept it yet. The days after discovering Emily's betrayal were a blur. I moved through life like a zombie, going to work, coming home, barely eating or sleeping. I couldn't get those messages out of my head. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was that smug grin on Derek's face, his words echoing in my mind. "Wish you were here." And Emily's reply, "Soon." I knew I couldn't keep living like this, pretending everything was normal when everything had changed. But every time I thought about confronting her, my chest tightened with fear. Fear of what she might say, fear of what I might lose. I kept telling myself that maybe it was just a fling, something that didn't mean anything. Maybe if I ignored it, it would go away. But deep down, I knew better. The breaking point came one evening about a week after I found the messages. Emily was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, that familiar, distant smile on her face. I was sitting across from her, pretending to read a book. But really, I was just watching her, waiting for her to slip up, to give me some clue that she was thinking about him. It didn't take long. She giggled softly at something on her phone, then quickly looked over at me, a flicker of guilt crossing her face before she covered it up with a bright smile. "What's so funny?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Oh, just something from work," she said too quickly. "Sandy sent me this ridiculous meme. You know how she is." "Can I see it?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. She hesitated for just a second, but it was enough. I knew she was lying. "It's not that funny," she said, laughing it off. "You wouldn't get it." "Try me," I insisted, setting my book aside and leaning forward. She tensed up, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. "I already closed it," she said, her voice tight. "Why are you being so weird about this?" I couldn't take it anymore. "Weird? You think I'm being weird? Emily, I'm not the one sneaking around behind my spouse's back, texting some guy about how much I want to be with him." Her face drained of color. For a moment, she just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "What are you talking about?" she finally managed to say, her voice shaking. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," I snapped. "Derek, Or did you think I wouldn't find out? The room was dead silent. I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second dragging out like an eternity. Emily looked like she was going to be sick. I don't know what to say, she whispered. Don't bother lying to me, I said, standing up and pacing the room, trying to burn off some of the rage that was boiling inside me. I saw the messages, Emily. I saw the photos, the texts. I know what you've been doing. Tears welled up in her eyes, but I couldn't tell if they were from guilt or fear. It's not what you think, she stammered. I swear it's not what I think. I cut her off, my voice rising. You've been cheating on me, Emily. You've been lying to my face for God knows how long, and now you're trying to tell me it's not what I think? She stood up, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I didn't mean for this to happen, she said, her voice trembling. It just got out of control. I wasn't happy, and he wasn't happy? I interrupted, my voice dripping with sarcasm. So, that's your excuse? You weren't happy, so you decided to throw away 8 years of marriage for some fling? It wasn't just a fling, she shouted, her voice suddenly full of anger. It was more than that. He made me feel alive, like I mattered, like I wasn't just some burden you had to put up with. Her words cut deep, deeper than I thought possible. A burden? I echoed, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. Is that really how you see me, how you see us? She didn't answer, just looked away, her silence saying more than words ever could. I couldn't believe it had come to this. The woman I'd loved, the woman I thought I knew, was standing in front of me, telling me she'd been cheating because I made her feel like a burden. I felt a wave of despair wash over me, threatening to drown me. I wanted to scream, to break something, to do anything to get rid of the pain that was tearing me apart. But all I could do was stand there, staring at her, wondering how the hell we had ended up here. Why didn't you just talk to me? I asked, my voice hoarse. Why didn't you tell me you were unhappy, that you needed more? We could have worked on it, we could have… I don't know, she whispered, shaking her head. I don't know why. I guess I didn't think you'd understand. Well, you're right about one thing, I said, my voice cold. I don't understand. I don't understand how you could do this to me, to us. I don't understand how you could throw everything away for some guy you barely know. She started to cry, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Not now. Not after everything she had done. What happens now? She asked, her voice small and broken. I don't know, I replied honestly. I really don't know. The days that followed were like walking through a minefield. Every conversation, every interaction between Emily and me felt charged with a tension that could explode at any moment. We went through the motions of our daily lives, but everything was different now. The house that once felt like a home was now a prison of unresolved anger and unspoken words. I started sleeping on the couch, unable to bear the thought of sharing a bed with her. The silence between us was suffocating, a constant reminder of the betrayal that hung over us like a storm cloud. Emily tried to talk to me a few times, but I shut her down, too hurt and too angry to hear anything she had to say. Work became my only escape. I buried myself in my job, staying late, taking on extra tasks, anything to keep my mind off what was happening at home. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, the reality of the situation was always there, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. One night, about a week after our confrontation, I came home late. The house was dark, except for a faint light coming from the living room. I stepped inside quietly, not wanting to wake Emily if she was asleep. But as I rounded the corner, I saw her sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in her hand, staring blankly at the wall. She looked up when she heard me, her eyes red from crying. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the silence heavy with everything we weren't saying. I was tired of the fighting, the tension, the constant reminder of what she'd done. I was tired of being angry, of feeling betrayed. "We need to talk," she said quietly, breaking the silence. I nodded, too drained to argue. I walked over to the armchair across from her and sat down, waiting for her to start. "I know I hurt you," she began, her voice trembling. "And I'm so sorry for that. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know how much I regret what I did." I didn't say anything. I just watched her, trying to gauge how sincere she was. She looked broken, a shell of the confident, vibrant woman I'd married. But I wasn't sure if that made me feel better or worse. "I never meant to hurt you," she continued. I was lost. I felt like we were drifting apart, like we were just going through the motions. And then Derek came along, and he made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I need you to understand that it wasn't about you. It was about me, about the things I was too scared to face. "That's the problem, Emily," I finally said, my voice low. "You didn't give me a chance to understand. You didn't give us a chance to fix things. Instead, you ran to him, like I wasn't worth the effort." She winced at my words, but I didn't pull any punches. I couldn't. "I'm not saying I'm perfect," I continued. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I've been distant at times, more focused on work than on us. But I never would have done this to you." Tears welled up in her eyes again, and she wiped them away with the back of her hand. "I know," she whispered. "I know I fucked up, and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just need you to know how sorry I am. I wish I could take it back, but I can't." I leaned back in the chair, staring up at the ceiling as I tried to collect my thoughts. A part of me wanted to forgive her, to find a way to move past this and rebuild what we had. But another part of me, a bigger part, couldn't get over the betrayal, couldn't forget the image of her with him, the lies she'd told, the trust she'd shattered. "What do you want, Emily?" I asked finally, my voice tired. "What do you expect to happen now?" She shook her head, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know what I want. I just know that I don't want to lose you." "You already did," I said softly, the words hanging in the air between us. She flinched, as if the truth of it had physically hurt her. But it was the truth, and there was no escaping it. What we had was gone. Destroyed by her choices, her betrayal. And no amount of apologies or regrets could change that. We sat in silence for a long time, neither of us knowing what to say, neither of us willing to be the first to leave. Finally, I stood up, the weight of the conversation pressing down on me like a physical burden. "I'm going to bed," I said, turning away from her. "Wait," she called after me, her voice desperate. Can we try to fix this? Please, I'll do anything." I stopped, but didn't turn around. I could hear the pain in her voice, the regret. But I couldn't bring myself to respond. Instead, I just walked away, leaving her there in the dark, alone with her guilt. As I climbed into bed, I realized that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The woman I had loved, the woman I thought I knew, was gone. And I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to find my way back to her, or if I even wanted to. The days turned into weeks, and the distance between Emily and me only grew wider. We lived in the same house, but it felt like we were strangers passing each other in a hallway. The tension was unbearable, a constant suffocating presence that hung over us like a dark cloud. We tried to keep up appearances, but there was no escaping the reality of what had happened. Every conversation was stilted, every interaction strained. We went through the motions, but there was no warmth, no connection. It was as if the betrayal had sucked all the life out of our marriage, leaving behind a hollow shell. Emily continued to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but her words felt empty to me. I didn't know if I was capable of forgiving her, or if I even wanted to. The anger and resentment were like poison, spreading through me, clouding my judgment, tainting everything I touched. One night, after another long day at work, I came home to find Emily sitting at the kitchen table. She had a bottle of wine open in front of her and 2 glasses, one of which was filled and waiting for me. I hesitated at the door, not sure if I could handle another heavy conversation. "Can we talk?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I sighed, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle into my bones. "What's there left to talk about, Emily?" "Everything," she said, her eyes pleading with me. "We need to figure out what we're doing, where we're going. We can't keep living like this." She was right, of course. We couldn't go on like this forever, trapped in a cycle of pain and silence. But I didn't know how to break free from it, didn't know how to move forward. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, running a hand through my hair. "Every time I look at you, all I can see is him. All I can think about is what you did." Her face crumpled, and she looked down at her hands, which were trembling slightly. "I don't know how to fix this," she said, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can, but I love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Love? The word felt like a bitter joke. If you loved me, you wouldn't have cheated. You wouldn't have lied to my face for months. She flinched, and I saw the tears start to form in her eyes again, but I was too far gone to care. The anger I'd been holding back for weeks finally erupted, boiling over in a way that I couldn't control. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" I shouted, my voice filled with a rage that surprised even me. "You've destroyed everything. Our marriage, our trust, our future. You've ruined it all." "I know," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "I know I messed up, but I'm trying to make it right. Please, I'm begging you, just give me a chance to—" "To what?" I interrupted, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "To prove that you're sorry? To show me that you can be faithful now that you've had your fun? How am I supposed to believe anything you say when you've already lied to me over and over?" "I'm not lying now," she insisted, desperation in her voice. "I made a mistake, a horrible mistake, but I'm not lying anymore. Please, I can't lose you. I'll do anything to fix this, to make it better." Her words were starting to blur together, drowned out by the roaring in my ears. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't listen to her apologies, her excuses, her pleas for forgiveness. I needed to get out, to escape the suffocating weight of it all. "I can't do this," I said, shaking my head. "I can't stay here and pretend that everything's okay. Because it's not, Emily. It's never going to be okay again." Her face crumpled at my words, and she reached out for me, but I pulled back, putting as much distance between us as I could in that small kitchen. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice small and broken. "I don't know," I replied, grabbing my keys off the counter. "I just need to get out of here. I need to clear my head." "Please don't go," she whispered, but I was already turning away, already heading for the door. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt a rush of relief, like I could finally breathe again. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change, and maybe, just maybe, getting out of that house was the first step. I drove aimlessly for hours, my thoughts a jumbled mess of anger, sadness, and confusion. I found myself at the edge of town, parked on a deserted road with no idea how I'd gotten there. The silence was deafening, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely and utterly alone. As I sat there in the dark, the reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. My marriage was over. Maybe not officially, maybe not on paper, but in every way that mattered, it was done. The woman I'd loved, the life we'd built together, it was all gone, shattered by her betrayal. And as much as I wanted to, I couldn't see a way to pick up the pieces. Not now, not ever. I spent that night in my car, parked on that lonely road at the edge of town. Sleep was impossible. My mind was racing too fast, filled with too many thoughts, too much pain. I replayed every moment of our marriage, trying to figure out where things had gone wrong. How had we gotten to this point? How had the woman I once loved become a stranger, someone capable of such betrayal? By the time the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the empty fields, I knew what I had to do. There was no going back to the way things were. Emily's betrayal had cut too deep, and the wound was still too raw. Every time I thought about forgiving her, about trying to rebuild our marriage, I was overwhelmed by a wave of anger and hurt. I couldn't live like that. I couldn't live with her, knowing what she had done, knowing that our marriage would always be tainted by her infidelity. It was time to end it. With a heavy heart, I turned the car around and drove back home. The streets were quiet, the town still waking up. As I pulled into our driveway, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. The decision had been made, and now all that was left was to follow through with it. Emily was still sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. She looked like she hadn't slept either, her eyes red and puffy, her hair disheveled. She didn't say anything as I entered the room, just looked up at me with a mixture of hope and fear. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady but firm. She nodded, her eyes wide, waiting for me to continue. "I've been thinking all night," I began, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "About us, about what happened, and about where we go from here." She opened her mouth to say something, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Let me finish," I said. "I've come to a decision, and I need you to hear me out." She nodded again, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them on the table. "I can't forgive you, Emily," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "I've tried. God knows I've tried, but I can't. Every time I look at you, all I see is the betrayal. I can't move past it, and I don't think I ever will." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't interrupt. She just sat there, listening, her face crumpling with every word I spoke. "I think it's best if we end this now," I continued. "Before things get any worse, before we hurt each other even more. We need to separate, to go our own ways." Her tears spilled over, and she shook her head, her voice a broken whisper. "Please, no. I don't want to lose you. I know I messed up, but I can change. We can fix this." I shook my head, feeling a pang of sadness in my chest. "It's too late for that," I said softly. "Too much has happened. The trust is gone, Emily. And without trust, there's nothing left." She sobbed openly now, her hands covering her face as she tried to stifle the sound. It broke my heart to see her like this, but I knew it was the right thing to do. We couldn't keep living in this toxic cycle, tearing each other apart. We needed to let go, to find a way to move on. "I'm going to find a place to stay," I said, standing up. "I'll give you some time to figure things out, to decide what you want to do, but I think it's best if we don't see each other for a while." She didn't respond, just continued to cry, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. I watched her for a moment, feeling a deep sense of loss, but also a strange sense of relief. The decision had been made, and now I could start to heal, to rebuild my life without her. I walked to the bedroom, grabbed a suitcase, and started packing my things. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else go through the motions. But as I folded my clothes and stuffed them into the suitcase, the reality of what was happening began to sink in. This was it. The end of my marriage, the end of everything I had once believed in. When I was done, I took one last look around the bedroom that had once been ours, filled with memories of better times. But those memories were tainted now, overshadowed by the pain of betrayal. I couldn't stay here any longer. I walked back to the kitchen, where Emily was still sitting, her face buried in her hands. I placed the suitcase by the door and turned to her one last time. "I'll call you in a few days," I said quietly. We'll figure out the details then. But for now, I need to go." She didn't respond, didn't even look up. I took a deep breath, opened the door, and walked out, closing it softly behind me. As I stepped into the morning light, I felt a strange mix of emotions: grief, anger, sadness, but also a glimmer of hope. Hope that somehow I could rebuild my life, even if it meant doing it alone. Leaving the house that day was one of the hardest things I've ever done. As I drove away, the weight of what had just happened settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. I'd walked out on my marriage, on the life we had built together. There was no turning back now, no undoing the damage that had been done. I checked into a small, nondescript motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the rooms are clean but far from fancy. It wasn't much, but it was enough. I needed somewhere to think, to breathe, to start figuring out what the hell I was going to do next. The first few days were a blur of numbness and disbelief. I wandered around the motel room like a ghost, my mind racing but my body too exhausted to keep up. I didn't eat much, didn't sleep much. My phone buzzed constantly with texts and missed calls from Emily, but I ignored them. I couldn't face her, couldn't hear her voice. Not yet. Instead, I spent my time thinking about the years we'd spent together, about where things had gone wrong, and about what my life would look like now. I didn't have any answers, just a lot of questions that felt too big and too overwhelming to tackle all at once. After a few days of wallowing, I forced myself to leave the motel. I couldn't stay holed up forever. I needed to start moving forward, even if I had no idea where that would take me. I took a leave of absence from work, using up the vacation days I'd been saving for a trip that would never happen now. My boss was understanding, or as understanding as someone can be when you don't tell them the real reason you're falling apart. I spent my days driving around town trying to avoid the places that reminded me of Emily, which, as it turns out, was pretty much everywhere. I found myself gravitating toward the outskirts of town, the places we rarely went together. I'd park the car and walk for hours, letting the fresh air clear my head, trying to make sense of the mess my life had become. It was during one of these walks that I stumbled across an old bookstore I'd never noticed before. It was tucked away on a quiet side street, the kind of place that looks like it hasn't changed in decades. I went inside, more out of curiosity than anything else, and was immediately struck by the smell of old paper and dust. The store was small, cramped with shelves that reached the ceiling, and it was empty except for an elderly man behind the counter who greeted me with a nod. I wandered through the aisles, running my fingers along the spines of the books, feeling a strange sense of comfort in the musty, forgotten air. I ended up spending hours in that bookstore, losing myself in the pages of novels and biographies, histories and poetry. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of peace, a momentary escape from the storm raging in my mind. I bought a stack of books, more than I could realistically read, but it didn't matter. I just needed something, anything, to take my mind off everything else. I started spending my days in that bookstore, escaping into the worlds of the books I found there. The elderly man who owned the store, whose name I learned was Mr. Jacobs, didn't ask any questions, didn't pry. He just let me be, let me sit in the corner with a book and a cup of tea, content to leave me to my own thoughts. In those quiet moments, surrounded by the comforting weight of books, I began to heal, little by little. The anger and pain were still there, but they weren't as sharp, weren't as all-consuming as they had been before. I started to think more clearly, started to make plans for what my life might look like now that I was on my own. I found a small apartment on the other side of town, far enough away from our old house that I wouldn't be reminded of everything I'd lost. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with creaky floors and outdated appliances, but it was mine. I filled it with the books I'd bought, stacking them on shelves, piling them on the floor. The apartment was sparse, but it was a start, a place to begin again. As the weeks passed, I slowly started to rebuild my life. I reconnected with old friends, people I hadn't seen in years, and found comfort in their company. They didn't ask too many questions, didn't push me to talk about what had happened, and for that, I was grateful. We went out for drinks, for dinner, for hikes in the hills that surrounded the town. I started to feel human again, like maybe, just maybe, I could survive this. Emily continued to reach out, sending me messages, leaving voicemails that I couldn't bring myself to listen to. I knew I'd have to face her eventually, to figure out the logistics of our separation, but I wasn't ready yet. I needed more time, more distance. One day, after another long walk through the town, I returned to my apartment to find a letter in the mail. It was from Emily. I hesitated, my heart pounding as I held the envelope in my hands, but eventually I opened it. The letter was short, just a few lines, but the words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'm so sorry for everything. I know I've lost you, and I understand if you never want to see me again. But I'll always love you, and I'll always regret what I did. Please take care of yourself. Emily. I sat down on the floor, the letter still clutched in my hand. I didn't know what to feel, anger, sadness, relief, maybe all three at once. It was over, truly over. She was letting go, and so was I. I folded the letter carefully and put it away in a drawer. Then I stood up, looked around my little apartment, and took a deep breath. This was my life now, and I was finally ready to start living it again. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly the pain began to dull. The sharp edges of anger and betrayal smoothed out, leaving behind a sense of quiet acceptance. I wasn't fully healed, not by a long shit, but I was learning how to live with the scars. The hurt was still there, buried deep, but it no longer consumed me. I settled into a new routine, one that revolved around work, my small apartment, and the comforting refuge of Mr. Jacobs's bookstore. I went back to my job after a month off, finding solace in the familiarity of my work, the predictable rhythm of my days. My co-workers didn't pry, and I was grateful for their discretion. They knew something had happened, but they respected my privacy, offering quiet support without pressing for details. The bookstore remained my sanctuary. Mr. Jacobs and I fell into an unspoken routine. He'd greet me with a nod and a cup of tea, and I'd spend hours lost in the pages of whatever book I'd chosen that day. It was a simple existence, but it was what I needed. The days were quieter now, more introspective, and I found myself reflecting on the future in a way I hadn't been able to before. As time went on, I started to think about what came next. The life I'd planned with Emily was gone, but that didn't mean my life was over. I began to entertain the idea of new possibilities, things I'd put on hold, dreams I'd shelved because they didn't fit into the life we'd built together. One day, as I was browsing through the shelves of the bookstore, I stumbled upon a book on writing, an old dog-eared manual filled with advice for aspiring authors. I picked it up, flipping through the pages with a mix of curiosity and nostalgia. I'd always loved writing, had even dreamed of being a writer when I was younger, but life had gotten in the way. I'd let that dream slip through my fingers, too focused on the practicalities of making a living. But now, with nothing holding me back, I found myself wondering if it wasn't too late to pick up that old dream, to try my hand at something new. The idea took root in my mind, growing stronger with each passing day. Maybe this was my chance to start over, to rebuild not just my life, but myself. I started writing in the evenings, just little things at first, a journal, short stories, random thoughts scribbled on napkins or the backs of receipts. It wasn't much, but it felt good to create, to put my thoughts into words, to channel the confusion and pain into something tangible. Writing became a way to process everything that had happened, a way to make sense of the chaos that had turned my life upside down. The more I wrote, the more I realized how much I'd missed it. There was a freedom in writing, a way to explore the world through words that I hadn't felt in years. It was like discovering a part of myself that I'd forgotten existed, a part that was still vibrant and alive, even after everything I'd been through. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I found myself back at the bookstore. Mr. Jacobs was closing up for the night, but he waved me in, gesturing to a chair near the counter. I sat down, and for a while, we just sat in companionable silence, the quiet ticking of the old clock on the wall the only sound in the room. "You've been coming here a lot," Mr. Jacobs said eventually, his voice soft and warm, like the old leather chairs that lined the store. "Yeah," I replied, smiling faintly. "This place, it helps." He nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. "Books have a way of doing that. They offer a kind of solace that's hard to find elsewhere." I looked around the store, at the rows of books, each one a doorway to another world. "I've started writing again," I admitted, surprising myself with the confession. Mr. Jacobs raised an eyebrow, a spark of interest in his eyes. "Is that so? What are you working on?" "Just little things," I said, feeling a bit self-conscious. "Nothing major, but it feels good, like I'm finally doing something for myself." He nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's the best reason to write. For yourself. Everything else is secondary." We sat in silence for a moment longer, the weight of his words settling over me. I realized then how much I'd needed to hear that, how much I'd needed someone to validate this new direction I was heading in. "I think you've got something there," Mr. Jacobs said after a pause. "Don't let it go. If writing makes you feel alive, then keep at it. You never know where it might lead." I left the bookstore that night feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, I felt a sense of hope, a glimmer of excitement about the future. There was still a long road ahead, and I knew I'd have to face more challenges. But for the first time, I felt ready to take them on. I wasn't the same person I'd been before Emily's betrayal. But maybe that was okay. Maybe this new version of me had something to offer the world, something worth exploring. And so, I kept writing, kept pushing forward day by day, word by word. The pain was still there, but it no longer defined me. I was learning to let go, to find myself again in the ruins of what had been. And in that process, I discovered something unexpected, my own resilience, my own capacity to rebuild, to start over, to create a life worth living, even in the aftermath of loss. Months passed, and the seasons changed. My life, once a tangled mess of anger and heartbreak, had slowly begun to take shape again. The apartment that had once felt like a temporary refuge now felt like home. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine, and I was learning to be okay with that. Writing had become more than just a hobby. It was my lifeline, the thread that connected me to a future I hadn't dared to imagine before. I spent every spare moment with a pen in hand or my fingers on the keyboard, pouring my thoughts and experiences into words. The process was cathartic, a way to purge the lingering pain and find meaning in the chaos. I wrote about everything: love, loss, betrayal, and the quiet moments of peace that had started to return to my life. One evening, after finishing a particularly difficult chapter in the story I'd been working on, I received an unexpected email. It was from a small online literary magazine I'd submitted a short story to on a whim a few weeks earlier. My heart pounded as I opened the message, expecting another polite rejection. But instead, I found an acceptance letter. They loved my story and wanted to publish it in their next issue. I sat there in stunned silence, reading the email over and over again to make sure it was real. My story was going to be published. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. For the first time, I felt like I was truly moving forward, that I was more than just the man whose marriage had fallen apart. I was a writer, and my words mattered. The next day, as I was getting ready to head out, there was a knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I hesitated before opening it. When I finally did, I found Emily standing there. She looked different, older, wearier, as if the months apart had aged her in ways that went beyond the physical. We stood there in awkward silence for a moment, neither of us sure what to say. It had been a long time since we'd last spoken, since I'd walked out of the house and left our old life behind. Seeing her now brought back a flood of emotions, anger, sadness, regret, but also a sense of closure that I hadn't realized I needed. "Hi," she said finally, her voice soft and uncertain. "Hi," I replied, stepping aside to let her in. She walked into the apartment, looking around at the sparse but cozy space. "This is nice," she said, nodding approvingly. "It suits you." "Thanks," I said, closing the door behind her. "I've been making do." She turned to face me, her eyes searching mine for some sign of what I was thinking. "I'm sorry for just showing up like this," she said, "but I've been thinking a lot and I needed to see you. To talk." I nodded, gesturing for her to sit down. We both took seats at the small kitchen table, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. "I've been doing a lot of soul-searching," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I've had to face some hard truths about myself, about what I did to us. I'm not proud of it, and I know I hurt you more than I can ever make up for. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed to tell you that. They offer a kind of solace that's hard to find elsewhere." I looked around the store at the rows of books, each one a doorway to another world. "I've started writing again," I admitted, surprising myself with the confession. Mr. Jacobs raised an eyebrow, a spark of interest in his eyes. "Is that so? What are you working on?" "Just little things," I said, feeling a bit self-conscious. "Nothing major. But it feels good, like I'm finally doing something for myself." He nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "That's the best reason to write. For yourself. Everything else is secondary." We sat in silence for a moment longer, the weight of his words settling over me. I realized then how much I'd needed to hear that, how much I'd needed. "I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry." I listened to her, my emotions a complicated mix of empathy and detachment. I could see the sincerity in her eyes, the regret etched into her features, but I'd come too far to let those feelings pull me back into the past. "I appreciate that, Emily," I said after a moment. "I really do. But we've both changed. We're different people now, and I think we both know that we can't go back to the way things were." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I know. I've accepted that. I needed to tell you how much I regret everything. I've been working on myself, trying to figure out who I am and what I want. I'm seeing a therapist, and it's helped me understand a lot about why I did what I did. But I know that doesn't change anything for you." "It's good that you're working on yourself," I said, genuinely glad to hear it. "We both needed to figure out our own paths, and it sounds like you're doing that." She wiped her eyes, taking a deep breath. "I am. And I want you to know that I'll always be sorry for hurting you. But I'm also glad that you found a way to move on. You seem better, happier, even." "I am," I admitted, a small smile tugging at my lips. "It hasn't been easy, but I've found my footing again. Writing has helped. It's given me something to focus on, something to look forward to." She smiled through her tears, a bittersweet expression that spoke of both loss and acceptance. "I'm glad, really. You deserve to be happy." We sat in silence for a few more moments, the air between us heavy but no longer oppressive. There was a sense of finality in the room, a quiet understanding that this was the last chapter of our story together. "I guess this is goodbye," she said finally, standing up. "Yeah," I agreed, standing with her. "Goodbye, Emily." She leaned in and hugged me, a brief but sincere gesture of farewell. I hugged her back, feeling a strange mix of emotions, grief for what we'd lost, but also a sense of peace. When she pulled away, she gave me one last, tearful smile before turning and walking out the door. I stood there for a moment after she left, the apartment feeling both emptier and lighter without her presence. This was it, the final page of a story that had once defined my life. But now it was just one chapter in a much larger book. I sat back down at the table, opened my laptop, and started to write. The words flowed easily, no longer weighed down by the pain of the past. I was ready to move on, ready to embrace the future, whatever it might hold. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free.